Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews. Today we talk about The Last of Us Part 2, a game I've been looking forward to for a very long time. Back when The Last of Us 1 came out for PlayStation 3, I had been living in Tokyo for 2 years. Though I had a PlayStation 3 back in the Netherlands, I did not have one in Japan. But I heard such good things about the game that I decided to buy a PS3 Lite for The Last of Us, and was not disappointed, because I think that game is an absolute masterpiece. Unfortunately, that is not the case really with its sequel. The Last of Us 1 came out in the period when the zombie survival genre was at its all-time high. Games like DayZ, Telltale's The Walking Dead, and more were enjoying an incredible amount of attention. But many of these games were made on a very small budget. Hell, DayZ was a free mod in the beginning. But The Last of Us was the first real high-budget zombie scavenge game, telling the emotional story of Joel, who lost his daughter during the outbreak, and Ellie, a 14-year-old girl who's immune to the infection and needs to be escorted to an organization to secure a vaccine. The setup was actually quite cliché, an older grumpy character teaming up with a foul-mouthed teenager, and in the beginning they don't like each other, but as the story continues, they grow to care for one another in a father-daughter type of relationship. But what was so effective about it was the overall cinematic experience. The voice acting, the facial expressions, the animation of combat, but also characters in general as they walked along cover, collected salvage, or small details like rubbing over the watch Joel got from his own daughter, Sarah. It was all of the highest quality, and the emotional part was actually so well done that The Last of Us 1 still remains the only game due to this date that actually made me cry. When Sarah, Joel's daughter, dies in the beginning, it was so sad that I actually had to shed a tear or two. It was really effective, and along the journey I went through with Joel and Ellie, I really got attached to both characters. They were often accompanied by very colorful people, all well written and voice acted. From the amazingly written female character Tess to Bill, Sam, Henry, and more. The gameplay also felt refreshing, with scavenging being a big part and you really getting that Walking Dead or DayZ vibe as you entered beautifully detailed buildings to gather stuff in rooms. It was very satisfying, alongside awesome combat with brutal animations that were really revolutionary for its time, despite the system in and of itself just being repeatedly pressing the square button. But the ending of the first game was also excellent, an absolute marvel despite being quite humble. It wasn't very climactic in a sense, but felt very human and real. Since Joel had lost his daughter Sarah, he always had trouble connecting with other youths. But through his journey with Ellie, he treated her as were she his daughter. That is why it devastated him when he finds out that in order to get a cure, Ellie will be killed in the process. So, Joel heads into the facility and kills all the bodyguards and doctors to save Ellie, even killing the unarmed leader of the faction that wanted to get the cure. Joel then lies to Ellie and says that it was impossible to find a cure, so they could return to the refugee camp that was managed by Joel's brother. The good thing about this ending is the human element I said earlier. Many times we speak of doing good for humanity or for the whole world, whereas in reality, our worlds or lives just revolve around a small amount of people. For most of us, our worlds consist of not much more than a boy or girlfriend, friends, and family. And that's it. Meaning that for Joel, his world would once again be destroyed were he to lose Ellie. Maybe some people might see it as selfish, but I think it is a very interesting philosophical and moral debate on whether you would sacrifice your own child in order to save humanity. I think many of us might not be able to do, which is why the ending was so good. And so The Last of Us 1 was an absolute gem, and thus I was very excited when The Last of Us 2 was announced. Especially also because Sony got a real good track record with first-party titles like Horizon Zero Dawn, God of War, and Spider-Man. But then about a month ago, the so-called leak scandal happened, where apparently a game tester leaked a lot of footage, including videos and transcripts on how the ending would play out. I deliberately did not take a look at these spoilers and had succeeded in avoiding any, and thus got to play the game as blind as a bat, just the way I like it. But I did catch a hint that many people were very disappointed or appalled by the spoilers and twists, and some even called it a spit in the face for fans of the first game. There were also those calling it a social justice warrior fest or campaign, yet I refrained from checking anything out before the game was released. In the end, I can say that in no way this game is a social justice warrior fest, but I can also say that I do understand why it can be considered a spit in the face for fans. Just a word of warning, I am going to spoil the game in this review, so if you have not played The Last of Us Part 2 yet, and you are planning on doing so, please do that first before watching this video. Let's begin. So The Last of Us 2 trailer showed that this time the focus would lay on Ellie. Understandably, since she is a lot older and can take better care of herself, and Ellie in and of itself is a very cool and likable character. But where I started to get worried was when they showed almost nothing of my main man Joel. I was completely down with playing as Ellie. You also do so for a large section in part 1, and I love that. But I was hoping to see Ellie and Joel back at it again, since their dynamic was so precious and part of what made The Last of Us 1 so great. And so when I saw the trailer, I thought to myself, oh god, they better not kill Joel at the beginning and have him appear as a ghost or something in Ellie's mind throughout the game. Turns out, I was wrong about half of that sentence. So The Last of Us 2 plays 4 years after the end of part 1, and has us take a look in the lives of Joel and Ellie as they go on patrols around the refugee camp that has now sprawled out into a large city. It's all beautifully detailed, and character animations and facial expressions are better than ever. A gorgeous game to look at. But in the beginning, you suddenly take control of a completely new girl in the form of Abby. They are looking for someone in the city, and I already began sweating when I heard this. But I tried to stay positive as you take control of her, and the game takes you through the tutorial basics. From the get-go, I could tell that Abby did not have the same charisma like Ellie did, and it just felt random to play as her, but whatever. Soon after, you do take control of Ellie again, as she and her love interest Deena go on patrol. There are a few real precious scenes here, and I thought that the relationship between the two girls was great. I say this and feel that I have to say this because over the next coming weeks you are going to hear a lot of people say that those who dislike this game are anti-women or anti-gay, and for me, none of that is true. I don't consider myself a social justice warrior at all, but I'm from Holland, the very first country in the world where gay people could marry, and I'm all for gay marriage worldwide, and I'm also for equal treatment of women and men no matter what race. Now then, the moment where it all goes wrong is when, within the first hour, The Last of Us 2 pulls an Alien 3. Joel gets killed in a brutal fashion so early in the game. Just what I was worried about. This is a huge flaw in my opinion, and is the moment I do indeed refer to as a spit in the face for fans of the first game. As time would progress and Joel would get older, I think most would agree that Ellie would take over the reins and Joel would slowly move to the background. I think many of us would even be okay with Joel dying in part 2, where at the ending, after he had done something, one final cool act, or we got a proper time to say goodbye to him. But this game does none of that, and gets rid of him before we could even have a proper interaction together. It is the same with Alien 3 that kills Newt, Hicks, and Bishop at the beginning, kinda making Aliens obsolete in terms of story. Or a Terminator Dark Fate, where they kill John Connor in the first minute, making the accomplishments of Terminator 2 Judgment Day meaningless. Or what about Metal Gear Solid 2? Snake doesn't die in that game, but you only get to play as him for the first hour or so, and then are stuck with Raiden, who is much less likable and cool. This also comes into play with The Last of Us 2, but we will talk about that in a bit. Movies like Alien 3 were criticized for this, also by official reviewers, and games like Metal Gear Solid 2 were also criticized for this by official reviewers. So I am a bit confused why this did not happen with The Last of Us 2. It makes sense that getting rid of a character you've invested in within the first hour of a new story will turn you off. Even with something like Game of Thrones, which I love, where they kill a lot of important characters so suddenly, many of those characters did manage to achieve something before they went out, like Ned Stark discovering the secret of the bloodline. It would be the same thing as having Lee from The Walking Dead survive Season 1, only to kill him in the first episode of Season 2. Again, part of what made The Last of Us 1 so amazing was the interaction and dynamic between Joel and Ellie, and that is now mostly gone with Part 2. Now, the game did let me experience something new I hadn't felt in pretty much any other game, and that was real anger and a craving for revenge. I never wanted revenge on a fictional character more than with The Last of Us 2 in the form of Abby. She beats Joel to death with a golf club, and I wanted her and all of her crewmates to die, slow and painfully. Boy was I riled up, and the game just gave me a huge letdown by killing such a great character so early on. But maybe, just maybe, it could make up for it by giving me a satisfying revenge story. After Ellie has recovered from the encounter with Abby and her gang, she and Deena decide to travel to Seattle to hunt down Abby's group. And this is where that familiar and lovely The Last of Us gameplay was introduced once again, but maybe a bit too familiar. What you basically do in the game is search apartment buildings and houses for stuff, and you pretty much collect the same type of things as you did in Part 1. I replayed Part 1 again right before 2 came out, so it was all fresh in my memory, and just reiterate again what a true masterpiece Part 1 was. The Last of Us 2 has you do more of the same stuff in a prettier world. You still look for different ingredients to craft familiar items like shivs, bombs, medkits, or Molotov cocktails. You collect bolts and iron supplies to upgrade weapons, and you collect pills in order to level up skills. Now, the latter has had the biggest upgrade, with now multiple branches you can unlock by finding certain magazines and training books, but the other things have not really had any significant upgrade or new additions. Even the weapons all are very traditional and don't really introduce any new kind. The attention to detail is great though, with so many different items and objects littered everywhere in the rooms and buildings, and really giving a personal taste to the environment, meaning you can really pin out where people who stayed there lived, ate, and slept, or what kind of entertainment they liked, like painting miniatures or playing board games. All very well crafted, and many of these optional areas get accompanied by spoken dialogue, which is delivered once again very expertly. The combat is more of the same, with again very aggressive and cool looking animations, but they make less of an impact now, since we got the same thing with the first game. In many ways, Uncharted 2 took great leaps ahead of Uncharted 1, and The Last of Us 2 plays it safe with that. It's very similar to Part 1 in terms of gameplay, and in my opinion, a bit too similar. One thing that is new is, for example, and greatly appreciated, is the ability to go prone, meaning you can now sneak through tall grass in order to sneak up on unsuspecting enemies and take them out silently. Anyway, you and Deena travel through the overgrown streets of Seattle as you pick up hints on the whereabouts of Abby's gang. Along the way, you meet some of them, and a handful do get a satisfying end with a shift to the neck or two. Seattle in and of itself looks gorgeous, as there's so much grass and leaves overgrown in buildings, making you want to go out and explore each and every location. In terms of gameplay, it might play too safe, but still stands as a house on how good it was ever since Part 1. It's very solid and still works in The Last of Us Part 2. Getting those DayZ and Walking Dead vibes in such a detailed environment is a true joy. The problems that arise are mostly just connected to the storytelling and story choices. For example, the journey of Ellie and Deena goes on like this for several hours. You don't meet any other characters along the way, which is such a shame, because the characters you meet and accompany in The Last of Us 1 are legendary and still leave an impression all those years later. The character Tess, a strong, independent, and cunning woman, is such a cool character who had survived the QZ of Boston, is not part but has connections with the certain high-ranking members from the Fireflies organization, knows how to use her street smarts, and can also hold her own when she is jumped by thugs. This all becomes clear by simply brilliant writing, but also action shown in her animations, dialogue, or cutscenes. The same can be said for Bill, which is a very interesting and sad character with a hot temperament who does not trust people easily. It's also hinted at that he was gay and had a male partner who he lost, and it was very emotional and left an impact despite only being with him for an hour or two. Same for the brothers Henry and Sam, two black siblings that were on the run as well. Again, a very tragic story and end, but excellently written and left an impression. The Last of Us 2 unfortunately lacks those types of characters. Deena is fine. She can be funny sometimes, but she is no Tess, Bill, Henry, or even Sam. The same can be said for Jesse, an Asian guy that accompanies Ellie sometimes as they are friends back in the camp, and Jesse is a nice bloke, don't get me wrong, and I didn't mind him at all, but he felt very generic. Like I said, you can tell so much about characters like Tess and Bill just by their dialogue and behavior. But in the end, I had no clue who Jesse was or what he was exactly about. I only know that he dated Deena. The end. You also pretty much never meet a third character along your journey. In the first The Last of Us, you often met new company while still having that awesome dynamic between Joel and Ellie. It felt like a third wheel joined the group, but that third wheel was often more than welcome. Because that lacks in The Last of Us 2, it just feels a bit empty and a bit unimpressive. But there are some highlights though during the campaign. And who do they involve? You guessed it, Joel and Ellie. At the end of each day, you get a flashback of a couple of years before to showcase something that happened involving Joel and Ellie. Especially the first flashback sequence was so precious and amazing. It made me smile and laugh out loud multiple times, but also made me even more disappointed that they did not go this route, as it proved just once again that the interaction and group dynamic between Joel and Ellie was such an important factor in what made The Last of Us so brilliant. In the first flashback section, Joel takes Ellie to a dinosaur museum for her birthday. Now I'm a bit biased since I love dinosaurs, and the museum is beautifully detailed with skeletons everywhere and signs and things to interact with at your leisure. The dialogue is also brilliant, since Joel refers to certain scenes from Jurassic Park and Jurassic World without actually naming the property. The scene then continues at the Space Museum, as another precious scene involving Joel giving Ellie a present, only to end in a somewhat horror-esque final segment. During this flashback, there's no action whatsoever, yet it has so much more heart and knows to capture so much more of my attention than multiple hours of regular Last of Us story and gameplay. The second flashback then has you have some old school infected fighting alongside Joel, and the final flashback has Ellie discover what Joel did at the hospital and how upset she got that her life became meaningless in her eyes. Anyway, you have for the next couple of hours, maybe around 10 or so, the same type of gameplay of looking through buildings for scrap and then fighting armed enemies or infected. Fighting the infected pretty much also still feels the exact same as in part 1, again signaling just how brilliant that game was. I cannot repeat that enough. But then, at around the 11th hour mark, the game does something that I had a small fear of ever since the tutorial, and it's something that again I think is a huge flaw. From the 11th hour on, the perspective switches, you play as Abby. Oh yes, the character I hated so much and was set to put my revenge upon was suddenly under my control. The reason for this switch is a time loop. The events spanning in Seattle occur over 3 days, and at the beginning of each day when you wake up as Ellie, you see the date in big white letters. When you switch to Abby, it starts you back off at the first day, meaning that it will now tell the story from her perspective during those 3 days you played as Ellie. You actually first play Abby when she's a bit younger, a couple of years ago, and get to see why she despises Joel so much. In all honesty, it's a very predictable reason. They even kind of give it away at the beginning by giving so much screen attention to a particular doctor, and thus yes, Abby is the daughter of the main doctor who was killed by Joel at the end of Last of Us 1. In my memory, I actually burned that guy to a crisp, but anyway, they play out the emotional response of Abby losing her father, yet it does not have the same tone as Joel losing his daughter or Ellie watching Joel die. I still hated Abby and could not wait for this flashback to be over and play as Ellie again. But to my surprise, not a positive one I might add, I continue playing as Abby, and for the next, I kid you not, 9 hours or so, you are stuck playing as Abby. And I absolutely hated this. And this is the Metal Gear Solid 2 part I was talking about in the beginning, and is to me mind-boggling why not more people criticize this. You are forced to play as this character that hasn't earned a spot amongst all the great characters of The Last of Us. Playing as Maria or Tommy would have been awesome, since they were minor characters, but they had already earned their spots amongst the cast. Abby just gets shoved down my throat whether I like it or not. And don't get me wrong, there is actually a reason why the creators want you to play as Abby, and we will get to that all the way at the end of this review. But even that reason is still not good enough to warrant so much playtime with a character I genuinely hate. And many of her companions too, for that matter. An interesting aspect though is that many of the characters Abby interacts with during her campaign are already dead or killed by Ellie by the time you play this. When you kill them as Ellie, you don't know anything about them, and so the ironic part is that you get to know these characters better whilst you know that they will soon be dead. An interesting notion indeed, but again, none of these characters get even close to Tess, Bill, or Henry levels. Maybe the one exception to that rule though was the minor character Isaac, who's the leader of Abby's faction. He's a real intimidating and stir character who's not afraid of torturing people of the opposing faction they are at war with. A very menacing character, pretty cool, but again, very underdeveloped since you barely know anything about him. Anyway, the drama in Abby's campaign comes in the form of her love for a character called Owen, who's again very generic and forgettable. And Owen is currently dating a medic called Mel, and even made her pregnant. Again, all while I was playing as Abby, I thought, I don't care about any of these people. Can I please play as Ellie again? What is happening here? It honestly felt like a Stockholm Syndrome game, where I was kidnapped and forced into controlling Abby until I would sympathize with her. Because the campaign of hers shows that she might not be the monster that you think she is. She helps a lot of people of her own faction and even gets into touch with two children of the Scars faction she is at war with. Now Abby hates the Scars and has killed a lot of them. But by interacting with these kids, she learns that not all the Scars are as bad as she thinks, and she learns compassion and mercy and even takes one of them under her wing. We've seen this type of story beat 1,000 times already, and could still have been done properly were we to control Ellie, because Ellie gets intertwined in the war between these two factions and she hates both. It would have been interesting, though cliche, if she were to meet some nice faces from both sides to realize that not all of them are psycho nutcases. So after having played as Abby for multiple hours, I still did not find myself growing to like her more. I thought it was interesting to learn more about some companions of hers, history or lore though, but it was all not as memorable as Game 1. Even when you meet the two kids from the Scar faction, Yara and Lev, they lack to make an impact. Lev though makes a bit more of an impact since you learn more about his role in the faction, his disobedience, his relationship with his mother, and take him under his wing, introducing him to the modern world. He's also a transgender character and it did not bother me in the slightest and fits pretty well in the story. I grew to like Lev the most throughout Abby's campaign. Yara, on the other hand, is unfortunately a very generic Asian girl type character that dies before you actually get to know her well. She does go out in a heroic way, which is cool. I will say though, that up until that point, the game has not really upped the ante with its scale, unlike Uncharted 2 that really upped the ante compared to Uncharted 1. There's a boat section and a truck section in Last of Us 2, but it's all pretty vanilla. But what did leave an impression though, and what was undoubtedly the best part of the Abby campaign, is the war between the two factions on the island. A huge war breaks out, and you find yourself right in the middle of it, dodging and fighting members on both sides as they slaughter each other. You even ride on horseback through a burning city as all hell breaks loose. It's really cool and cinematic, and this does feel like a proper step up. Shortly after, you finally get to the point where Abby and Ellie meet, and I was hoping to finally switch back to Ellie and kill Abby once and for all. But to my absolute horrid surprise, the game had me control Abby as I needed to fight with Ellie. I really had no intent on doing so, and felt completely forced and kinda like a gimmick. I thought that maybe it's a choice. Maybe if you let Ellie kill you, the story will progress and Abby will die and then you will switch back to Ellie. but the game just gives you a game over screen and have you try again, even giving you tips on how to attack Ellie. I can tell you that in this section, I let Ellie shoot, slice, and burn me multiple times just to see Abby die, and it felt glorious. But in the end, the battle turns nasty and Deena gets involved and almost gets killed, with Abby even being happy and intending to kill her when she finds out that she's pregnant, a response to finding her friend Mel killed by Ellie, who was also pregnant. And this is where it struck me that I came to understand why the creators have you play as Abby for so long, and even with this realization, it did not help that the story felt inferior to part 1. See, the game tries to show how similar Ellie and Abby actually are with their want for revenge. During Abby's campaign, she constantly talks to Owen about leads that they found on where Joel could be, and basically the rest of the game and Ellie's life revolves around finding Abby in order to kill her, and in that sense, it destroys her social life with everyone she knows, much like it did for Abby. What's more, Ellie actually pleads for Deena's life and says that she has nothing to do with their battle. In the final scene of the game, Ellie threatens Lev, and this time Abby does the pleading, once again showcasing the similarities between the two. But this feels forced and unearned and very much calculated by the creator. It is as if we are being talked down upon by a school teacher saying, "Hey, these two are quite alike. You might think you hate this person, but she's actually a lot like you. Now, doesn't that change your way of thinking? Well, doesn't it?" And the answer is no. Again, it's completely unearned and forced. Joel and Ellie earned the respect and love by how great they were as characters and their relation that worked so well to one another. That is very different than me suddenly having to play as a character I don't like, don't know, and having the game tell me, see, she's not the monster you might think she is. She is a human being, and yes, I get that, but she killed Joel, and I like Joel, so even if I do acknowledge that she helped people and is not the devil itself, she still needs to pay, much like her crewmates did. After the first fight with Abby and Ellie is over, the fight ends in a draw and Ellie having her arms broken. The next scene is a couple of years later when Ellie and Deena live on a farm with their son JJ, a very cute kid. These scenes are once again very precious, and I love to see Ellie happy like this, kissing Deena on the neck and shoulders. But it did not feel like a proper ending, and indeed soon after it becomes clear that Ellie is still suffering from PTSD. What's more is that Tommy is now also obsessed with finding Abby, and heard of leads near California and asks Ellie to check it out. This is once again to emphasize on the obsession over revenge, much like Abby did with Joel. So then the final segment of the game starts, and it is a surprising and very welcome change to the sunny beaches of California. You then take control once again of Abby, and it reiterated just how much of a misstep it was to introduce her into this story, since I did not care for her at all, and still did not care for her when I controlled her again after not having gotten to do so for several hours. Honestly, having me play as Lev would have been much cooler, because he has no blood on his hands of any characters that I love. You basically play as a traditional bit with Abby, and then get captured by a new group of psychos. The world is full of them, huh? Then it switches to Ellie again. Hooray! As she will now follow into the steps of Abby once again. You have a final confrontation with this psycho group, a very cool one I might add, where you can also unleash chained infected, as they will then walk around and devour the psychos. You end up heading towards the prison cells to confront Abby and learn that she is at a place called the Pillars, an area near the coast where prisoners get hanged on poles to die a slow and horrible death. This is then where Ellie discovers Abby and frees her so she can finally confront her. The fight that then follows is pretty amazing. It's bloody, gruesome, fierce, and horrifying at the same time. It just shows the worst kind of what we humans are capable of doing to one another, and you end up cutting and beating Abby to a bloody pulp and eventually start to drown her, only to stop right at the end and let her go. And that's it. She stops drowning her because she sees a glimpse of a flashback of Joel, whatever that means. In some movies or shows, you actually have the partner of the main character come in and scream at the main character to talk sense into them or convince them not to turn into the same monster as they are trying to kill. This in a sense makes more impact because it means that the partner has kept the humanity of the main character, the one person they care so much about. But that is completely absent here, since Joel is dead, Deena is not here, and it is simply a 1-second glimpse of a flashback. Abby gets away, pretty much scarred for life though, so maybe good for her. And then Ellie returns to the farm, only to find it abandoned as she plays guitar and then leaves. There's also a flashback on the night before Joel's death, where she says she might not be able to forgive him for not letting her be used for the cure, but she would like to try. Not a very strong ending, and leaps and leaps and leaps behind of what The Last of Us 1 achieved with its humble yet so impactful ending. And that's where we are right now. An emotional roller coaster to say the least. This game made me an emotional wreck. It made me angry, sad, happy, angry again, hopeful, and also disappointed. It honestly did something and pulled out emotions I normally don't have with most other games, and in that sense I actually wondered if it is indeed maybe a masterpiece like so many reviewers claim it to be. But then I started thinking about it, and do I want a sequel and see the story continued? No. Will I ever play this game again and relive the story? I don't think so. I have no interest whatsoever in revisiting Abby's story, and the gameplay isn't varied enough to sustain the 22-hour campaign. The combat sections can actually become quite repetitive throughout it. In no way does it surpass the first counterpart, except graphics and sound. But characters are not as interesting. The gameplay is still the same, which is good, but doesn't get pulled to a new level, and the story just feels like a mess. Scoring this was really difficult. Production-wise, it is an absolute amazing achievement. It looks and sounds perfect, earning a lot of points on that part. Gameplay is also solid, despite becoming a bit repetitive and still feeling too similar to part 1. It's the story and the characters that lower the score, which are so important for such a narrative game. I probably have The Last of Us 1 somewhere at a 9.3 or 9.4, though I should do a review of that game someday on this channel. But The Last of Us 2 in the end will get a 7.9, which might seem high despite my long list of criticisms, but as I said, it earned a lot of points with great production quality and solid gameplay. Were the story good, or the Abby section not 9 hours, then it would have probably been closer to a solid 9. It honestly is not necessarily a game I can recommend to fans of the first game. I felt like the characters did not really grow all that much. Ellie, of course, has the biggest development, involving her and Deena, how she copes with the knowledge, what went down at the hospital, and Joel being gone. But it doesn't feel like a development that was necessary to tell to the gamers, no matter the cost. Of what I understand, a lot of the original people that worked on Last of Us 1 had already left Naughty Dog while they were creating Last of Us 2. And maybe that might have contributed to this inferior sequel. But for now, I hope this is the last of The Last of Us.